All right, it is 12 o'clock and it's Wednesday, so it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. And hope everyone is having a great day. It's a beautiful, beautiful day here in Iowa. Sure, it's a nice change from last week. And I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and faculty advisor to the Iowa Learning Farms. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague today, Dr. Jacqueline Comito. That's an anthropologist, Iowa Learning Farms director, and adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management here at Iowa State University. I've had the good fortune to work with Dr. Comito for a number of years now. And as has become tradition since we started the weekly webinars, and I guess is third in a row that we've done on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We have Dr. Comito. We're fortunate to have her give a talk, and maybe something a little bit different than we have some other weeks. So maybe a little less technical and more thinking. I think was last year Hope, Jackie?
No, last year was actually revision.
Okay, what's the first year? It was
Hope.
2020.
No, it's Hope.
Okay.
It was Hope.
Okay.
You're right.
Okay. All right. See, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Comito. And as always, if you have questions for her, feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll get those to her at the end of her talk. And with that, the virtual floor is all yours, Jackie.
Okay. Hello. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to start with a provocative question. Can we imagine a healthy river in Iowa? And I'm going to come about this question in kind of a unique way. Just to start off with some background. Just for those of you who don't know me, I am an anthropologist. I am an adjunct faculty in natural resources ecological management. I have now 18 years of working in conservation and water quality. I lead the Iowa Learning Farms and Water Rocks. I also lead the conservation learning group. And as a part of that job, I've had to do some video work. And for Water Rocks, I do some songwriting and do some singing. So I do a lot of different things in my role. You know, as those of you are familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, I'm always struck by this sentence that I read by her, where the environmental crisis is at that junction between nature and culture. And so this series I've been doing over the last 3 years is to explore what exactly does that mean? How do we sit between that juncture? And then how do we use maybe some of these tools we don't often think about? How do we use those to successfully maybe solve some problems? So there are stresses on the system. I'm not telling you anything many of you out there don't know. Maybe several of you were victims to the derecho, not the one that happened 2 years ago, but the one that happened last December. And it became on the list of one of those multi-million-dollar disasters. We saw prolific bacteria at Spirit Lake Beach this year. No one can forget Hurricane Ian and how that storm is making them rethink Florida's coastal property market. All of these stresses. And we even see it when I interviewed some of the college students here in our 3 Iowa University campuses. This is a quote by a male where he says, I grew up in a really small town, and I remember at like 1 p.m. getting the school announcement over the speaker. And it's like, hey, you can't drink out of the water fountains today because we just did a water test. So that's here in Iowa. And we do know that there is this thing that they are calling, and it is now an official diagnosis of eco-anxiety. It's just this chronic fear of that something disastrous is going to happen environmentally. And it is of great concern in our next generation. So it's no surprise that we heard this when we were out talking and listening to college students in the state. This woman at the University of Northern Iowa basically said that she's choosing not to have children because she thinks it's the most sustainable thing to do. She goes on to talk about overusing our resources and what's happening in the Amazon rainforest. And she just doesn't think this is a place to bring children. And then tying into that eco-anxiety, she's like, I'm almost too scared to answer the question about how do we fix it. I'm so scared of it that I tense up and freeze. And then this guy from the University of Iowa said, climate change, it exists for one. I'm sure that's not really a controversial statement anymore. It exists and it's kind of threatening my future. So not particularly happy about that. It's a source of worry. And I use these two quotes because they are very representative to what we heard from a lot of different students on these campuses. And I'll talk about this a little bit more as I talk about other things, but we did the same interviews 10, 12 years ago. And when we asked about climate change, we hardly heard any student express that much concern, maybe one or two. In this case, I'd say maybe one or two didn't express a concern. This is a quote this is actually a poem by Gus Speth, the end of his poem that I think is very inspiring, and it probably pushes and informs why I do these presentations. What we need is not more analysis, but a spiritual awakening to a new consciousness. So let's bring on the preachers and the prophets, the poets and the philosophers, the psychologists and the psychiatrists. Let's bring on the writers, musicians, actors, artists, call them to strike the chords of our shared humanity, of our close kin to wild things. So in other words, again, that acknowledgement, as I've been saying for the last couple of years, those who have joined me the last couple of times, and if you didn't, you can go back and watch those webinars on archive. It takes more than just, no offense, Matt, but we need more than engineers. We need more than scientists. We need more than environmental lawyers. We need to be bringing everything that we have culturally available to help solve some of these problems. So how do we do it? So the last, 2 years ago, I said we'll do it with awe and gratitude. Awe inspires people toward genuine concern and engagement in behaviors that protect the environment. If you don't believe me, go back and watch that webinar, and I support that with some science. Gratitude changes our brain and helps make us more altruistic. Revising your stories means we need to revise our personal worldview and our collective worldview, one story at a time. Like a friend of mine who works in the environmental field just said to me yesterday, she said, it just seems like we're still just nibbling around the edges, but there are some sacred cows when it comes to the environment that we absolutely refuse to change when it comes to the environment and agriculture. And that maybe part of this talk is to say, can there be any of those things? And do we just need to open our mind to how big and broad the change could be? And then the final thing I did deal with last year, Matt was correct, is hope. And I gave this way of thinking about hope, that it is rich imagery, and the imagery then is going to tie into talking about imagination and anticipating what challenges, like, in other words, what could go wrong. You link that to action and equal hope. I just heard a podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I love them. I just heard one where the person used the word hope and said, oh, no, I don't mean hope. I mean, it's got to have action. And I would have said to her, well, that's exactly hope, because without action, it's not hope, it's optimism. And then finally, today, we're going to add imagination to this, and I'm going to explore what that means in just a second. But before I do that, let's look and see where I'm getting my data and what I'm using in terms of the college students' perspectives on water issues. So from January and March 2022, we did an online survey, and we got lucky. We were able to get people to cooperate with us at the University of Iowa and University of Northern Iowa. And so we sent surveys out to all the undergraduates. And we got 2,281 surveys back, a 6.5% response rate. Now that breaks into, and for University of Iowa and UNI, University of Northern Iowa and University of Iowa, we only did one mailing out. And so we got, a pretty good percentage from that. 30% of our survey is UNI, 28% is University of Iowa, and 42% is Iowa State. At Iowa State, we did actually take a couple swings at getting the survey answered. I know 6.5% doesn't sound like it's good, but it's actually pretty good for an online survey, especially if you think of this population that we were trying to get to participate. And then for the on-campus interviews, we did the same thing we did 12 years ago. In April, we set up a camera in a very well-trafficked location. It's very opportunistic sampling. We did it on all 3 campuses, and we interviewed 60 students, a total of 20 per campus. So here's one of the interesting observations. I've got first of all, a couple of gratitudes I need to express. Kudos to Ann Stout for her help with this PowerPoint. Without Ann, I am not visually as interesting. And the second thing is Liz Ripley did the analysis of the survey data thus far, and she's the one that pointed out to me a really interesting thing that we see in the data. So let's look at these 3 campuses and their relationship to their watershed. The Skunk River in Ames is 4 miles from campus, and Ames is like at the headwaters of the watershed. The Cedar Falls, they're about the Cedar River is about 2.5 miles from campus, and they're in the middle of their watershed if you look at the larger watershed. And then the Iowa City is 0 miles from campus, and they are at the bottom of that watershed. And so you're like, well, does that matter? It does seem to matter when we look at the data and their attitudes. So I'm calling it the Goldilocks syndrome. Does familiarity breed contempt? Iowa State students were most likely to say the drinking water is safe, and the University of Iowa students were least likely to say that the drinking water is safe. Here's a quote from a University of Iowa student. I'm aware that some of the faucets here in Iowa, I guess, tend to have a brown tint to it. Not really sure what that is about. I typically use a Brita filter whenever I drink water. I do notice, however, if the brown water comes out of the shower, it goes away after a little bit. Female from Iowa State University. My dad says Ames's water is the best water. Does familiarity breed contempt? Iowa State students are the least likely to say that the surface water quality is poor. And Iowa students are the most likely to say that the surface water quality is poor. And UNI, once again, falls somewhere in the middle. So here's a female student from the University of Iowa. Oh yeah, there's a huge problem. It's ridiculous. Yeah, we've got agricultural runoff, so fertilizer in the water. I mean, the Iowa River is disgusting. I would never swim in it. You'd probably get cancer. Iowa State student, male student. I don't know, I guess. I haven't heard much about a water problem, so I'm going to say no. And then the UNI student fell right in the middle. This is one of my favorite quotes. I just feel like obviously it's going to be better quality than some places, but everywhere you go, there's going to be occasional spot where the water quality isn't as good as it can be. And even if it's considered decent, I feel like there's always room for improvement in certain areas, maybe not in certain cities like Cedar Falls, but in smaller cities, I'm sure there's at least some not perfect, not as good water quality as it can be. So right there, UNI right in the middle. So getting back to that question I started the presentation, can we imagine a healthy river in Iowa? And so I'm going to say is I didn't ask that question, and it's unfortunate because how might these campus interviews have changed had I asked this question of the students? Had I challenged them to not just say ask them about water quality and ask them whether they'd recreate in the river. If I really phrase it that, okay, what would this look like? Do you understand? Do you know? And it might have actually gotten them to start thinking in that way to say, oh, wait, I'm not a victim to the future, but I'm somebody that can imagine the future the way I want it. And maybe in imagining it, I can move toward it. I'm inspired by the writing of Toni Morrison and actually just listening to her. And I was really struck when she talked about how she got her students to write better. And I think this just means how to get them to think better when they're looking at things. And she said, I tell my students one of the most important things they need to know is when they are at their best creatively, they need to ask themselves, what does the ideal room look like? Is there music? Is there silence? Is there chaos outside? Or is there serenity outside? What do I need in order to release my imagination? And I feel like that we do not ask our students enough of. We don't ask that enough of ourselves. What do I need in order to release my imagination? New scholarship suggests that is the imagination along with improvisation and not language that makes humans humans. Now you're going to say, Jackie, how do they possibly study that? Well, they look at when they see what part of the brain is being imaged when you're doing imagination work, and they have all sorts of studies they come up to. And then they look and see what part of the brain is being used with language. And they think about what parts of the brain that is. So they make that hypothesis. I'm not saying this isn't a somewhat controversial one and highly debated, but it's provocative in its scholarship. This is a great book if you're interested. This sounds really interesting. The Evolution of Imagination is the book where Stephen D. Asma is looking at this. And he says, flying by the seat of our pants is not just some analogy to pre-linguistic communication. It is the thing itself. In other words, it's the thing that was happening and going on before we created language. So flying by the seat of our pants, you all know it when you experience it. It's that exhilaration you get when you don't know how to do something, but you have to do it anyway, and you figure it out as you go. I mean, and that's the story of probably every great engineer sometimes. It's the story of all of us when we're creating something. I can give you a bunch of different examples of when we did that with Water Rocks and created that program. And he goes on to say that we should think of imagining the verb form rather than imagination. So in other words, it's not a facility, it's actually a process. It's more consistent to what we see in the brain as we are imagining. The word imagination, it comes from the Latin, which means to picture oneself. It drives everything from arts, engineering, philosophy, social sciences, marketing, cosmology, all of that. It makes all possible what is, what has been, and what might be. And as I'm reading, it's elemental to who and what we are as humans. Imagination is that mental process that mediates between what is present and what is absent. It's a state of exploring the space between those two things. Now, let's look at this circle. So now we're going to be a little participatory here. Take that circle, and if you got a piece of paper somewhere nearby, I want you to make that circle into something. So everybody take a moment and do that. Okay, for those brave of you that have done this, I want you to show up, like undo your video and show me your picture. Let's see what everybody did. For those who feel brave enough that they want to do that. Okay, Krista's showing us she did is that the earth? Nope. We got a flower. Oh, we've got the Zin and Zang. Look at that. We've got the sun. Perfect. The circle became the sun, so a couple of you came up with the sun. Anybody else out there? What is that? It's cool. Matt, what is it?
I don't know. It's like a square. I'm a typical engineer. I make it into a square.
So let me show you. This is, my team will love this for those who are on from the team. So we took the circle. We made it into a sheep. So look at this demonstrates that, what was present and what was absent. And that's where the imagination exists. How many people thought sheep when they saw that circle? But that's what I thought when I saw the circle. I love this quote by Einstein. This is back in 1929 in an interview. He says, "I am enough of the artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world." So one of our greatest, maybe if we see him this way, scientists saw that the key to his success was actually imagination. If imagination lets us feel at home in the world, it also enables us to get things done in the world. So many of our failures, and dare I say a few of our successes, are in fact failures of the imagination. So what he's saying here is some of our successes is maybe our successes aren't really successes because we didn't think big enough, broad enough. So imagination, it helps us get things done in the world. So what is it? Research shows that imagination might help alleviate fears and anxiety. So this is the interesting thing. They're starting to do therapies with people who have anxieties about things by getting them to imagine the threat, but without the negative consequences. They actually improve their ability in real life to deal with these things. So if you have a fear of something, you can go through some of this theory and imagine it, and you can actually alleviate it. Imagination also, just if as an environmental philosopher contends Western metaphysics and ethics need revision before we can address today's environmental problems, then environmental crisis involves a crisis of the imagination. So we have to find a better way of imagining nature and humanity's relationship to it. Imagination is really powerful. You can actually imagine, if you're a piano player, you can imagine playing a piece in your mind, and your fingers physiologically will change. Neurologically, connections will be made. So imagination is a much more powerful tool than any of us think. I love this thing that we're in a crisis of imagination, because I've heard this expressed a lot about where we're at in this world in terms of trying to solve these environmental issues. So how do we imagine nature and humanity's relationship to it better? So Asma combines both imagination and that idea of improvisation. He says that is one of the greatest tools open to society. The improving culture, I can never say this word well. The culture that improvs is robust and capable of significant shock absorption. It has great stories of potential solutions to unforeseen challenges, because experimentation is already a part of the cultural matrix. So let's think about that a second. When we think of the world we're in right now, there's a lot of people like kind of shouting at each other, but it feels like we're all still fighting over things that maybe were true 30, 40, 50 years ago. So can we become a more resilient society by imagining what we can be, not trying to fight for what we were or what we thought we should have been, but what can we be? And I think with the environment, that's really significant. So now, because I realize a lot of you are people who deal with the world in a very practical way, so I'm going to give you some really practical tips to how you can release your imagination. One, you can stand back and you can reflect. And it's funny, whenever I say to people, man, we just got to take a pause. We got to think about things. Most people say, I don't have time. But in many ways, a lot of what the science is telling you is you don't have time not to. That if you don't stand back and reflect, you can't come up with some good solutions. And some of the people in our society that most need to do this are probably the ones that are stuck in meetings 5, 6, 7 hours a day. So not a good use of their time. We need to give them time for reflection. Why don't we take our best and brightest and stick them into admin positions and then expect that we're going to solve some problems? The second thing we need to do is we need to ask questions. Start with questions. Like I said, I screwed up with the students. I was asking them questions. I wasn't asking them a particularly good question. Like, I think we asked them, is there a water quality problem in Iowa? It's not a particularly interesting question, is it? But can we imagine a healthy river in Iowa is a much more interesting question. And what I think is great, so last week, the students at Ames High School did a science fair of sorts. I think it was the freshman and sophomore science classes, or maybe just the freshman science class. Their teachers put them through an examination of the Iowa Creek in Ames. And they were trying to teach them the scientific method. And so Ann Stout and I went to watch the second day of the science fair. And it was great to go and question the students about their work and the questions they asked, and then the data they collected, and then how they assessed the data. I'm happy to report that it seemed like most of the students clearly understood what a watershed was. So that gave us lots of joy. But then I felt we are a little bit like the story of the wise blind men and the elephant, where whichever part of the elephant they were touching, that's what they thought the river was, or what the creek was, and what it needed. And hopefully in the class, they're going to bring it all together. But they were learning the importance of asking the right questions. And so that was really exciting to me. And I hope that we are doing more of that on that level. But then I thought to myself, well, they were doing it in ninth grade. Maybe we should be doing more of that in 5th and 6th grade. So the next thing is we need to be playful. As adults, we have to be a little bit more playful. Creativity comes out of playfulness. Imagination is at the heart of playfulness. Even in our jobs, sometimes don't you feel like it's just a drag? But if you can be playful, and I have to, on that idea of playfulness, I recently have been out on farms with farmers quite a bit, more than I had been for a while. And the one thing that still stands out to me is that farmers, one of the reasons the farmers that do cover crops love cover crops is there is a certain joy and playfulness as they try to tweak around to make these successful. And there's an energy to their conversations. And then the next one, a creative collaboration as they all get together and exchange ideas. It is contagious in its enthusiasm. And I always feel that when I am around farmers who are saying, you know what, I don't have to do what everybody else does. I'm going to try to do some things a little differently. Seek the unexpected. You know, how do we seek the unexpected? And with seeking the unexpected, it also needs we need to take a page from the Adam Grant book called Rethink or Think Again. We need to revise. We need to revamp. That ties into last year's webinar where I was talking about revising our stories. Revise our ideas about what's going to work out on the land. Revise our ideas of what's going to be successful. Then we need to experiment. And that's actually right now, I would say we're really strong with trying to experiment. That's what the whole cover crop experiment is. I just was out on a farm where they were putting in wood chips at the base of a blind inlet. And that's an experiment to see, will this work? And if it does, is it a game changer? Because suddenly we can put these everywhere. And then the final thing that we do to release our imagining is to stay hopeful. And like I mentioned, I explored hopeful in spades last year. So go back and check out that webinar. But we have to stay hopeful. Remember, hopeful is anticipating what problems. By the way, you want your imagination to get going. Think about what could possibly go wrong. A vision and then action. And then I add this from all the reading I did. I add that we got to fly by the seat of our pants once in a while. And in some cases, I'm going to encourage all of you that might be a little bit workaholics, go take a trip to a place you've never been and don't have a plan and just see what happens. You'd be surprised when you get back to your job in a week or 10 days or, you know, whatever it is, how much more creative and better you are at your job. Putting ourselves in situations that is what I'm reading, one of the most human of human things to do, which is fly by the seat of your pants, releases so much in terms of your creativity and your ability to problem solve and critically think. Another way to think about imagination or imagining is it actually takes two processes in our brain. The first thing we're going to do is that process of sitting and just imagining things and being playful and creative and art, all of those things I just mentioned that imagining can unleash it. But then the next step in our brain, it's almost like we should call it our engineering brain. We have to have focused attention to it. Okay, this is what I imagined, but how can I get it done? And those two things combined is what actually makes creativity. If you want to read more about it, this article I reference here is that goes into the science on how they discovered this is how this works. So I'm asking all of us, can we imagine a healthy river in Iowa? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Are birds singing? Who's nearby? What's in the water? The Ames High students, they started to do this, but they only had like one person looked at soil and one person looked at the vegetation. Another person actually measured the water quality. But they didn't bring it all together. And I'm hoping that's what they end up doing. Nobody actually did a wildlife study that I noticed. Maybe somebody did. But where are we in that? A friend of mine just said today when I was telling her about this question, she said she can imagine a healthy river in Iowa. It's one that her kids could play in and she doesn't need to worry about what they're being exposed to. Let's start to try to ask these better questions. And maybe if we do, we're going to have more fun at what we do, and we might end up coming up with better solutions. And as I end all my talks, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. Thank you so much. And now you can be writing your questions while we do our commercial, right, Matt?
That's correct. You have, yes, we We absolutely can. So if you're on here and need a CCA credit, email Elena Whitaker by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And let's go to, okay, we're going to have Lauren Salvato, that's with the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association, UMBRA, talk about water quality trends on the Upper Mississippi River from 1989 to 2018. So we still got time for questions. We got a couple in there, but I will just highlight that as somebody who sits in a lot of meetings all the time, I do find maybe my most productive thoughts are when I'm walking across campus and just have time to let my mind wander. And maybe that's one of the things with the new age of Zoom. I have a lot less of that time than I used to because I'm going from one meeting to the next. So I need to do a better job of making a little more time. Okay, got some questions here. This one is, how do we open people's minds for them to see our imagination? Are there any keywords or phrases to make people see what we see?
See our imaginations, or see the ideas or notions that come out of our imaginations.
Yeah, that might be, yep.
I think we just have to be brave enough to share it, and we've got to be prepared to be criticized. I can give you a great example. When Ann and I came up with the idea of water rocks and we were presenting it to the administration in extension, we kept saying, we have to do this program that's going to teach them the science, but it also has to be fun. And the VP kept saying, but it has to be good science. And we're like, oh, sure. Yeah, the science is a given, but we got to make it fun and imaginative and inspire students' creativities. And we were pretty much like, Water Rocks is as successful as it is now at 10 years. When we were in year 1 or 2 or 3, we were told that it wasn't something that could work. So sometimes you just got to be brave enough. We didn't get the first grant we wrote, but we got the second grant we wrote. You got to be brave enough. You got to listen to feedback, because sometimes your criticisms, even if it hurts, are where you find the keys to your success. So I guess I'm throwing it back at you a little bit and saying it's not about making people listen. It's about you listening to how they're responding to what you're saying. Because again, I can use actually learning farms too. Early on, we were pretty highly criticized as we tried to revamp the program and make it into what it is today. So in the heart of that criticism, the people were listening to you. They just didn't like what they heard. And you got to not be afraid of that, but then you got to listen to that, because that feedback is going to become the basis of how you create something successful. If you just listen to the people who like what you're saying, you're not going to get anywhere.
One comment here is we sometimes have people in leadership who don't trust imagination if it doesn't produce or make a profit immediately.
Oh, amen. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And so sometimes, but think about it. Some of the biggest breakthroughs in this world have been somebody who was told it wasn't going to make a profit. You weren't going to be successful, but they tried anyway, and they tried small. They started small, so sometimes if you got to just do it maybe on a smaller scale to begin with.
Okay. So I don't think you asked this question, or you didn't, but this is kind of getting at your question of if they could imagine a water body, because this person asked, did you ask any of the students if they had been to a water body they would like a river in Iowa to look like?
No, because I didn't ask the other question.
Yeah, but that would be kind of an interesting way if they could, because sometimes it might not be like, I might not be able to describe what it looks like, but I could maybe describe a body of water I've been to that I really enjoyed.
This actually is something, this is important. And I forgot to bring this up in my presentation. One of the problems with listening to the students is, these are all 20-year-olds. They can't even, it has become the way our rivers look today. That's just how they have to leave the state to see a river that they think, and maybe for some of them, it's going up to Minnesota or Wisconsin or some other place, or some of their even country. But in the state of Iowa, they're kind of just used to our rivers looking the way they look. And so it's even hard to talk about what a healthy river would look like, because they're just so used to it. And honestly, I'm in my 50s. I can't even think back to But I do know with some of the lakes that they looked a little different when I was young. So it's an interesting thing that it's kind of become what our lakes and rivers look like is become what we think it looks like. Even the Mississippi, man, it gets a bad name. I know they called it the muddy Mississippi, but that wasn't all the time.
Yeah. Well, don't you think so? This is kind of so you and I both have spent some time, you more than me, but on Spirit Lake, Big Spirit in Northwest Iowa, and they redid a shoreline on Big Spirit in the last 2 years, right? And so for a lot of people, they took out a lot of trees, removed the undesirable trees. For a lot of people, it's, well, that doesn't look like it did, most recently, but actually it's probably looks more like it was at the time of settlement, that, when there would have been fire, reducing some of the encroachment of those trees. Actually. So it's beautiful. Yeah. Once you like take away what you think it should have looked like, because what it did most recently, it's really, you get a different appreciation. Okay. So there was another question from getting at the survey and interviews with the students. What did they see as the biggest contributors to water quality issues in the state? And maybe what was it consistent between the three institutions? Oh, and just a second, what was the thing that Liz brought up that was maybe you said it and I spaced it out.
Their proximity to the river.
Oh, proximity to the river. Okay.
It's not just proximity to the river, it's where they were in the watershed.
Yeah.
Now that's a great question. And actually, I forgot to mention that we will be publishing all the findings of this study in probably January, February. Liz isn't on, so I don't know if she's going to panic when I say that, because she's really helping me with that. But we'll be in the spring, look for the whole study to come out. But I can't answer this question. The students were pretty consistent. So I let them pick three different causes. And they consistently picked agriculture as the number one cause from the students. And that was actually across all three universities. There was an acknowledgement that agriculture was a cause. The other interesting thing, because we asked them who's responsible, because they're not tied up so much in some of, I think, what are the politics in the state of Iowa, they believe very firmly that government has a really big role to play. And as much as we hate to admit that, they're not wrong. Government does have a big role to play when we are talking about collective water body, even though we're talking about a lot of private land. So we also surveyed, by the way, this survey is a big one. It's got over 5,000. And we have farmers and urban people and rural non-farming people in it. When we compare their answers, the students by a large percentage think that government has a big responsibility. And the other people in the state, the non-students who responded, feel very strongly that it's a lot of other people. Government has a role, not a big role.
So I think this is a good comment, and it makes me think of what I've done in my office is I've taken down my diplomas and have a picture of a stream in there, and I find that more a little bit better to look at. But this person says, thanks for the good ideas. They do landscape design, build, and have been gifting clients paintings that have an environmental theme at the end of the project to inspire some extra thought. I do the paintings while working on designs and helps me through the creative process. And I think that's pretty interesting.
That's super cool, actually. Thumbs up to that person. I love that.
I figured that would be like hit you right at the core. And they indicated they've had some success with aerating turf and overseeding with prairie mix, and they've good results in their front yard and avoided using some chemicals. Another question is, in the students' feedback, did they comment on the role of corporations or the private sector totally, in this? Yeah.
Actually, interesting. The role of corporations came up really strongly when we were talking about climate change. In fact, I'd say in the in-person interviews, corporations came up before governments. Corporations have to make the changes, and it was less government on climate change. On water quality, it's still on the water quality side, it's agriculture. I mean, in terms of what needs to be changed, but we're the state of Iowa. If we did this survey with college students in places that have more industries that aren't farming and not agriculture, it'd be a different answer. But when it came to climate change, absolutely, it's corporate issues.
Right. I think those are the questions. Thanks for the questions. Thank you, folks, for tuning in today. I wish you. Oh, there is one here.
Okay.
Okay. So they had. Oh God. Okay. There's here. Okay. Can you talk more about gratitude leading to altruism? How do you encourage gratitude when engaging with students or the public, or is it
Okay,
leading
so
by example?
I'm going to reference you to the very first webinar I did on these topics 2 years ago, because I go into that in spades and give you some tools to use, some great ways to express more gratitude and have more of those awe experiences. So I think like that's a whole webinar. So I encourage you to go check that out. You can find it on the Learning Farms website.
Search your name. So with that, we are done. I really want to thank Jackie for the presentation. I think it gives us all something to think about. I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving and have some time to get out and do a little imagining yourself these next few days. It looks like the weather may allow it, at least here in Central Iowa. I know we have some people from other places on. So I wish you all happy Thanksgiving. Stay safe, and thanks again, Jackie.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks everyone for joining us.